It's great to be here and to have this opportunity to share this with you. I've been a missionary since I was 3 weeks old. That's when I became a missionary. I became a missionary when I was baptized. And that's our understanding for those of us who are Christian, whether you're Catholic or part of another faith tradition, that when we're baptized, we are baptized into the mission of Jesus. When I was in second grade, I was in Catholic school, and I don't know if anyone else had that experience, that around my age or a little bit older, in Catholic schools when the nuns were still there, teaching in the schools and the habits. And one of the things that the sisters were very, very good at, even when you were in like first or second grade, is kind of instilling in you this romantic notion of what a missionary was. That this was the most exciting and most important thing that you could do with your life, was to become a missionary for the faith, to live this out. I don't know if anyone else has had that experience when you're growing up. And they would hold the missionaries out to be like the Catholic superstars, like the superheroes. And you know, people like St. Damien, who went to Hawaii and worked with the lepers. Or you know, this great tradition we have of all these men and women who led these courageous lives. And the thing is that they'd put them up on pedestals so much that it would be something you'd think, that really isn't me. That's something that I could never do. That was just too far out there on that. So I never thought of myself as somebody who, you know, could live up to that expectation of being one of those superheroes of the church. One thing that happened that completely changed my perspective on what I was doing and my understanding of myself was as a missionary was that very early on I was sent to go down to Lima, Peru for a mission immersion trip to see what we were doing. So I went down there and I spent time with Father Pete Byrne. And his ministry in Lima, Peru was to work with the street kids. Lima is a big city in Peru, in Latin America, and is often true in many of these large cities in the developing world. People who live in the country, in the campo, think that if they come to the city, that they're going to find jobs, that they're going to find housing, that they're going to find health care, that they're going to find education for their kids. So they leave their little farms or whatever they were doing in the country, and they come into the city. And of course, when they get to the big, bustling city, what do they find? There's nothing for them. And it's actually a very inhospitable environment. And they end up forming shanty towns, or we call slums. And the pressures that poverty puts on a family are you know, immense, and causes the family to break down. So you'd have a lot of problems with children who were living in these slums, in these rings of, you know, poverty that just radiated out from the city, that they end up being neglected by their parents, or even worse, in some cases they end up being abused, or simply because of the poverty in the situation, that they're at some age pushed out and told that they have to fend for themselves, that they have to make that, you know, more children have come along, now you need to go out and fend for yourself out on the streets. So there are a lot of kids on the streets who are out there trying to make it on their own, you know, as young as 6, 7, 8 years old, and of course the teenagers and so forth. And what Father Pete would do is he would go out into the streets and he'd befriend these kids and talk to them and offer them an alternative to living on the streets. And the alternative to living on the streets was coming to one of the orphanages where he was working at. And so as soon as we get off the bus and we're walking towards it, these kids spy that Father Pete's coming. And all of a sudden they tell the other kids, and they start streaming out and running out and yelling his name and hugging him and embracing him. They're so happy to see him. And we go into the compound, and it was I don't remember which day of the week it was, but whenever he would go there, he'd always celebrate Mass with them. It was one of the few opportunities they had that. And they had Mass in the same place where they ate, the same place where they gathered, which was a pole shed, you know, with just poles with a tin roof over it. And they all gathered together, and Father Pete begins the Mass by saying, "How many of you believe that you are loved by God?" And all the hands go up, and they all, I do, and they all, a lot of yelling and stuff like that. But then he continues with the Mass. So afterwards on this event, I had a wonderful day with these kids at the orphanage, and we're going back on the bus. And Father Pete says to me, "What did you think?" And I said, "Man, that's great." He goes, "What did you think of the kids at Mass?" And I said, "Well, I come from a suburban parish in California. You can't get kids to come to Mass hardly at all. And when you do get them at Mass, they just sit there. They're not very much engaged in it." I said, "This was amazing. I haven't been to a Mass like that where kids were so engaged in the liturgy and so excited to be there." He goes, "What did you think of the question I asked at the beginning about whether they believed that they were loved by God?" And I said, "That was great." He goes, "I've always asked that question at the beginning of every Mass. I asked it at the very first time I went out there to work with them." He goes, "Do you know what their response was the first time I asked that question?" Dead silence. They looked at me like I was from another planet. He said, "That's when I realized what my job was, what my mission was, what my task was going to be in terms of working with these kids. That these were kids who had been abandoned, who had been neglected, who had been told by their parents, who had been told by the community, by society, that they were unloved, that they were not lovable. And they had this experience. So of course, how would they ever believe that God loved them when they had been told their whole life and had been pushed out of their families or had been abused or neglected?" He said, "So I knew that my job was then to somehow bring to them an experience that they would feel loved." And he did that over a course of many years of just being with them, listening to their stories, helping them with their homework, and being present in their lives with them. And that's when I understood for the first time really what mission is. Mission is bringing God's love to other people, and especially those people who have gotten the message that they're not loved like those kids were. And this was just one of many, many different experiences I had during those couple weeks down in Lima, Peru. So by the end of my 2 weeks there, I thought back to second grade, and it's like, I met the superhero. I know what a missionary is now. It's these guys who do these amazing, incredible things. And so when I was getting ready to leave, I said to him, "I can't thank you enough for this opportunity, because now I have a firm, complete understanding of what Maryknoll's about and what mission's about. It's God's mission that we're trying to accomplish." So if we want to know what God's mission is, then I think the next question that we have to ask ourselves is, who is God and what is God's mission? If there was one word to describe who God is, what would you say? Go ahead.
Father.
Father. What about others? What do you think? One word. You had one word to describe who God is. Creator. Any other words come to mind?
Missioner.
A missioner. Savior. Any other words that pop into your head? Almighty. If we were to find one word that kind of captured all these things that we're talking about, it would be love. You got it. It would be love. If there was one word that we had to describe God from our Christian perspective is that God is love. Now that we have a new Pope, Pope Francis, in terms of looking back now at Pope Benedict and wondering what Pope Benedict's legacy is going to be. What is Pope Benedict going to be remembered for? And one of the things that I hope that he's going to be remembered for is his very first encyclical. Encyclicals are the highest level of teaching in the church. These are the documents that popes put out that have the full authority of the church's teaching. So they're very important documents. And Pope Benedict, before he was a pope, was a theologian and a professor. And so you know that this was important to him in terms of a way of reaching out and teaching. So I don't think it's any mistake, nor do I think it's insignificant, that his very first encyclical that he wrote was entitled this, God is Love. And in this document, what Pope Benedict lays out for us and shares with us is our Christian understanding of who is God, that God is love. And that this not only tells us who God is, but it tells us who we are, because we are created in that image and likeness of God. And Pope Benedict kind of raises that question too in terms of love as a term that gets thrown around. What does it really mean? And what he says is there's two aspects to love, usually. One is eros, which is desire, and that's the thing that draws us into relationship. Pope Benedict says that reflects what God's love is for us, that God has that desire to want to be in relationship with us, that God created us to be in relationship with him, and that God has that desire. He says the flip side of it is called agape, because if it's just eros, if it's just desire, and it's nothing else, what's the danger of what happens to it? It becomes all about me and what I can get out of it. And so it can then become about possessiveness. It could then just become about lust, because it's all about what I'm going to do to get my needs met. He said the flip side of it, that balances it, is called agape. And agape is the nature of love, which is the self-giving. Pope Benedict says our understanding of who God is as love is that it's both those dimensions. That God has a desire to be in relationship with us, and that God wants to give of God's self to us. God offers his love to people, and people get the choice whether to accept it or reject it. Puts a whole new light on what it means for God to be all-powerful. God is all-powerful by becoming the vulnerable one who puts himself or herself in the place of people deciding whether or not they're going to accept God's love or not.